Today we're going to be taking a look at the nitrogen cycle. Now last week we took a look at the phosphorus cycle. This week we're focusing on nitrogen. And nitrogen is a key element in all living things because nitrogen is part of the nitrogenous base in DNA. So it's in every single molecule that we have. It's in our amino acids, so it makes up the building blocks of life. So it's a really key element that we need to have cycling in our environment. Now lucky for us that the majority of the atmosphere is nitrogen. Now the bad part about that is that it's in the form of N2. So nitrogen gas is a form that most living things cannot use. But 78% of our atmosphere is nitrogen, so there's plenty in our ecosystem to be able to cycle through. Now taking a look at this diagram, you can see that this one is a lot more complicated than the phosphorus cycle. So I am going to shift gears here and actually draw this cycle out so that we can see how this atmospheric nitrogen gets converted into a type that can be used by plants, goes up through our plants, through our living organisms, and then gets back and cycled back to our atmosphere. So I'm going to shift gears here and try to draw this out. So like I said, the majority of our gas in our atmosphere is N2. Okay? Now the bad part is that cannot be used by any living things. But what it can be used by is bacteria. So I'm going to draw some grass here because these bacteria are found underground. So there are 5 key steps to this cycle. Now the first cycle is going to be nitrogen fixation. So I'm going to try to color code these to keep this straight. So nitrogen fixation is when atmospheric nitrogen goes into the soils and is converted from N2 to NH3, which is ammonia, and then it picks up a free hydrogen ion in the soils and becomes ammonium. Now that ammonium can be used by plants pretty easily. So this is done, like I said, not many things use that nitrogen in its form that it's in the atmosphere in the form of N2, but bacteria can do this. So these are nitrogen fixing bacteria. These are a particular type of bacteria. So this is our first step, that is nitrogen fixation. Now this is done in high concentrations on the roots of a particular plant that are called legumes. So legumes are part of the bean family. So we will draw our roots out here, and they're in particular little sections of their roots that are called root nodules. So these have high concentrations of these nitrogen fixing bacteria that live there. So they can take that atmospheric nitrogen and convert it into something that can be used by plants. Now there's also a second step though that we'll go through, and that second step is nitrification, because this ammonium, while it can be used by plants, it's not the most efficient way. The best nitrogen form for plants is actually nitrate, and that's why you find nitrate in our fertilizers. So there's a second step that converts that ammonium to nitrates, and that is also done in our soils. So what happens there in step number 2 is that ammonium is converted to nitrates. Now this is done by bacteria, and these bacteria are free in the soils. So once it gets there, now it's in a form that can be used by plants. So once it's in that nitrate form, it can be taken up through the roots of plants. So I will draw a tree here. So in this step, we have plants absorb that nitrogen. So that step is assimilation. where the plants can absorb that and then have it incorporated into their tissues so that it can be used by living things. Now, very similar to phosphorus, we have to get into plants first to get into living things. So once we get into our producers, we're able to get into herbivores. So I'm just going to draw a bunny. Okay, so once we get into our plants, we go into our herbivores, and that's our way through the food chain. And that's how that nitrogen can be incorporated into the DNA of all living things, where we get those nutrients from eating. Now, living things will contribute back to the nitrogen cycle through their waste, but also through death and decomposition. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to kill this bunny. Just put a little X there. So through decomposition, what occurs is that those nitrogen compounds will get recycled through in a process called ammonification. So here, our nitrogen wastes and our decomposition will go back to ammonia through our fourth process of ammonification. So that process will help to recycle some of these nutrients because there is never new nitrogen that will be made. So we always have to recycle the nutrients that we have. So through waste and through decomposition, nitrogen is put back into that cycle, and it just kind of hooks back into here where it will become nitrate and it will become assimilated again up into the tissues. Now we haven't closed the cycle yet, because we haven't gone back up into our atmosphere. And so the way we do that is again through bacteria. And should have mentioned, the ammonification is done by bacteria. But I'm changing the color of the bacteria because they're all different types of bacteria. Our nitrogen-fixing bacteria, they will live on the root nodules. Our nitrifying bacteria, they will live in the soils. Our ammonifying bacteria, they live in the soils, and our denitrifying bacteria, they also live in the soils. So there's going to be some leftover nitrogen that doesn't all get used up by plants. So we'll have some ammonia and ammonium. We'll have some nitrites and nitrates. And what will happen is bacteria in the soils will take that leftover nitrogen and put it back into our atmospheric nitrogen through the process of denitrification. So now that will finally close out our cycle. So this cycle is pretty complicated, so I'm going to talk it through one more time. We have nitrogen gas in our atmosphere that's abundant. 78% of our atmosphere is made up of this gas. So it's very abundant, but not usable by living things except for the bacteria that live in the soils. So bacteria will go through the process of nitrogen fixation. And nitrogen fixation takes that N2 and converts it to ammonia. Now this can be done by free bacteria in the soils, but on the root nodules of legumes, our bean plants, you have these root nodules that have high concentrations of this nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So they can greatly increase the amount of usable nitrogen at the roots of those plants. So they'll go through the ammonia, it'll pick up that free hydrogen ion. Free bacteria in the soils will put it through another conversion to nitrites and then to nitrates. Those nitrates can be taken up by plants through the process of assimilation. Once we get into plants, that's our ticket into the food chain, into all living things. So it starts with our herbivores, works our way up through the food chain. All living things, plants and animals included, will contribute back to the nitrogen cycle through their waste and decomposition, where bacteria will go through the process of ammonification, or the creation of ammonia, where it will hook back into this cycle. Now, to close this cycle out, we have denitrifying bacteria that will take leftover ammonia and ammonium, nitrites and nitrates, and convert it back into our atmospheric nitrogen. So to summarize our 5 steps, we have nitrogen fixation. It takes that atmospheric nitrogen, converts it to ammonia, and then ammonium. We have nitrification, where it takes that ammonium, converts it to nitrites, and then nitrates. We have assimilation, where plants absorb those nitrogen compounds. We have ammonification, where the nitrogen waste is converted to ammonia and then ammonium. And then we have denitrification, where it takes the leftovers and puts it back. Now, some of the key things about this cycle are that it is driven by bacteria, and most of it occurs underground. Now, there are definitely some human impacts that we need to address. So one big human impact that we have is we plant legumes. Okay, so farmers might practice in particular something like polyculture, because if you plant legumes in with, say, corn is notorious for taking a lot of nitrogen out of the soils. So if you go through polyculture, maybe plant it with some soybeans, the soybeans will actually be putting nitrogen into the soils right next to something that might take nitrogen out. Now, another thing that we might do is we might put fertilizer on there. So that's a big impact of the nitrogen cycle, that we add fertilizer onto our crops to make sure that they can grow, because nitrogen can often be a limiting factor. Now, with that fertilizer, one of our problems might be that fertilizers might lead to runoff, and that runoff might lead to eutrophication. So that's one big negative impact. The polyculture was a positive impact. The fertilizer leading to eutrophication is definitely a negative one. Another big negative impact that we have on this is that humans burn fossil fuels. If you remember that fossil fuels, one of our compounds is NOx. Now, NOx is a negative impact on our environment because that can lead to smog as well as acid rain. So that changes the distribution of nitrogen in our atmosphere. So that's another big human impact that we have on the nitrogen cycle. So our biggest ones are fertilizer, which leads to runoff and eutrophication, as well as the fossil fuel burning that leads to smog and acid rain. So those are our biggest connections that we can make, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in our face-to-face.